On my son's 30th birthday, I stood at his front door with a letter in my hand, the kind of letter that had taken me 3 decades to write. I thought it would be my redemption, but the only thing I got was the sound of a door shutting in my face. I didn't come there to beg. I came to explain why I wasn't there when he needed me the most, why I missed his games, his graduations, his life. What I didn't know was that there were truths hidden from him, truths that could change the way he remembered me. But first, I had to stand in the rain, holding a letter he didn't want to touch, wondering if my chance to fix everything had just slipped away forever. For years, people told me time heals wounds. They never told me that sometimes time just builds thicker walls. I wasn't just fighting for forgiveness. I was fighting for a chance to tell my side of the story before my own time ran out. There was a reason I stayed away back then, a reason no one told him. And on this birthday, I planned to reveal everything, whether he wanted to hear it or not. What happened after that? Well, you might think you know, but you don't. Stay until the end, because this isn't a story about a father begging at the door. It's about the truth that's been waiting 30 years to finally be heard. My name is Richard Hayes, and I am 62 years old. For most of my life, I built things: bridges, towers, stadiums, structures that still stand firm even after decades. I was good at my work, meticulous even. But the one thing I couldn't seem to build, no matter how hard I tried, was a lasting relationship with my own son. I became a widower 20 years ago when my wife, Claire, passed away. She was the glue that kept our family together. Without her, the house grew silent, and my connection to Daniel, the boy we both loved, grew thinner by the day. People said I buried myself in work to cope with the loss, but the truth is, I had buried myself in work long before she died. That was part of the problem. Daniel was 8 when his mother passed. At that age, children still think their parents are invincible, that they can fix anything. But I couldn't fix what happened. I couldn't even fix myself. I thought sending him money, paying for school, making sure he had the best of everything would somehow make up for my absence. It didn't. A child doesn't measure love in dollars. He measures it in time, and time was the one thing I kept failing to give him. When I was younger, I believed I was doing the right thing. I thought I was providing. Every extra shift, every late night at the drafting table, I told myself, this is for him. This is for Claire. This is for our future. But I missed piano recitals, birthday parties, and Sunday dinners. One time, I promised I'd take him fishing. That weekend, the company needed me in Chicago. I called home from an airport lounge, thinking I'd explain. All I heard on the other end was silence. Claire didn't need to say anything. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting what I was becoming. The years after Claire's death were a blur. I traveled from site to site, my hands busy, my mind restless. Meanwhile, Daniel grew into a man without me truly noticing. I'd see his life in pieces. Photos sent at Christmas, a postcard from college, a wedding announcement I learned about after the fact. It wasn't that he hated me. Hate would have required energy, emotion. What Daniel felt for me was worse. Nothing at all. I kept a picture of him on my desk, taken on his first day of school. His hair was sticking up in all directions, his backpack too big for his small shoulders. That image never left me, even as his face changed in real life. Sometimes I'd take the picture out late at night, stare at it, and wonder if he even remembered the sound of my voice. People assume that a man my age spends his retirement golfing, or traveling. My retirement looks different. It's quiet, lonely. I wake up, make coffee, and sometimes just sit in my kitchen, reading old letters I never sent. Over the years, I've written Daniel dozens of them. Apologies, explanations, memories I wanted to share. Some letters were long, carefully typed. Others were scribbled on hotel stationery in the middle of the night. Most ended up in a drawer in my study, sealed but undelivered. What kept me going all these years was a thin thread of hope. I told myself that someday the timing would be right. Someday he'd be ready to hear me out. I imagined us sitting on a porch, maybe with a couple of beers, talking like two men who'd finally set the past aside. That dream kept me warm during long winters. Still, I knew the odds. Estrangement doesn't vanish overnight. Trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild. But as his 30th birthday approached, something in me shifted. 30 was a milestone. It marked not just his life, but mine too. It was a reminder of how much time had passed, how little I had left to make things right. I started preparing weeks in advance. I went through my old letters, rereading each one. Most were too clumsy, too full of excuses. But one letter, written 5 years ago, felt different. It was honest, stripped of pride. In it, I told him about the sacrifices I'd made that he never knew about. I told him about the contract I turned down, the $1 million project I refused because it would have taken me overseas for years. I wrote about the games I attended quietly from the sidelines, too ashamed to approach him after years of absence. I rewrote that letter, updated it for the man he is now, but kept the heart of it intact. This letter wasn't about asking for forgiveness. It was about telling the truth before it was too late. Every morning, leading up to his birthday, I practiced what I might say if he opened the door. In my head, I rehearsed different versions of his reaction. Anger, indifference, maybe even surprise. But deep down, I knew the most likely outcome. Nothing at all. Still, I couldn't let that stop me. I had built bridges out of steel and concrete. Now, I was trying to build one out of words and hope. And even if it collapsed, I needed to know I had at least tried. As the day approached, I found myself standing in front of my wardrobe, choosing the right shirt as if it mattered. I picked the blue one Claire had once said brought out the color of my eyes. It felt strange, almost ceremonial, like preparing for a meeting with the past. On the morning of Daniel's 30th birthday, I stood in my living room, letter in hand, staring at the clock. Every minute felt heavier than the last. I told myself that no matter what happened at that door, I was finally ready to face him. I was ready to face whatever came next. The distance between Daniel and me didn't happen overnight. It grew like rust, quietly, invisibly at first, until one day, the structure we had just wasn't there anymore. I spent most of my working life as a civil engineer. The job came with a steady paycheck, but it also came with deadlines that didn't care about birthdays, anniversaries, or Saturday mornings at the park. I told myself I was doing it for my family, that every missed dinner was an investment in their future. But in reality, those absences piled up. Daniel's 10th birthday party was supposed to be at the lake. I had promised to take the day off. The night before, my project manager called. There was a problem with a foundation pour downtown. It's just one day, I told myself as I left early that morning, missing the candles, the laughter, the look on his face. It wasn't just birthdays. His first high school baseball game? I was on a job site 3 states away, the night he won a regional science fair award. I was stuck in a hotel conference room. Each missed event was another brick in the wall between us. The truth is, I didn't want to be absent. I wanted to be there. But there's something about being a provider that twists your logic. You start to believe your presence can be replaced by the things your paycheck buys. That belief is a lie, one I learned too late. There's one story Daniel doesn't know. Twist 1. 15 years ago, I was offered a project that could have changed my life. A $1.2 million contract overseas, leading a skyscraper build in Dubai. It was the kind of opportunity engineers dream about. But it came with a price, 3 years away from home. At the time, Daniel was a teenager, sullen and distant, barely speaking to me except when he had to. I remember sitting in my office late that night, the contract spread out on my desk. My colleagues said I'd be insane to pass it up, but then I thought of him, my son, already slipping away from me, and I couldn't do it. I turned it down. I stayed in the city, took smaller projects, made less money. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I was physically closer, there'd be a chance to rebuild what was broken. But I never told Daniel about the offer. I didn't want to make it seem like I was expecting gratitude for something I should have done as a father. Claire knew. She was the only one. I still remember the way she looked at me that night. "You did the right thing, Rich," she said softly. "He doesn't need to know why you're here. Just be here." And so I stayed. But being here wasn't as simple as moving a pin on a map. Daniel was already used to me being absent. My presence didn't erase years of missed moments. We were living in the same city, but it might as well have been different worlds. That's the part that still stings. He never knew. He never knew about the choice I made. In his mind, I was the father who always put work first, no matter what. And I suppose, from where he was standing, that looked true. The misunderstandings deepened over time. I'd show up to his events uninvited, standing quietly in the back because I didn't want to embarrass him. Once, at a college football game, I saw him on the field, helmet under his arm, scanning the crowd. For a split second, I thought his eyes met mine. Then he turned away. I don't know if he ever saw me. I left before the game was over. These moments piled up, not in his memory, but in mine. I have 1,000 snapshots of my son's life that he doesn't know I witnessed. I thought being there quietly was better than not being there at all. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe silence looked the same as indifference. The real tragedy is that Claire, the one person who might have bridged the gap between us, wasn't there to explain after she passed. She had always been the translator between my awkward attempts at connection and Daniel's unspoken need for reassurance. After she was gone, all that remained were unspoken words and misunderstandings. As Daniel grew older, he built his own life, career, friends, eventually a wife. I became a distant relative, the kind you see in family photos because someone mentions them in passing, not because they're truly part of your life. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly. The missed events became the narrative. Dad doesn't show up. And every time I did show up, it didn't rewrite the story. It just made the absences loom larger. That's the core of our estrangement. Not just absence, but misinterpreted absence. He didn't see the nights I chose staying home over leaving for a better job. He didn't see the times I sat in my truck outside his house, debating whether to knock on the door, afraid of another rejection. The worst part? I can't blame him for any of it. From his perspective, I was just gone. And in some ways, I was. As his 30th birthday approached, I knew there were truths he needed to hear, not as excuses, but as the missing pieces of a puzzle he had been assembling all his life. Whether or not he wanted to hear them was another story. But for the first time, I felt ready to try. The choice I made all those years ago, the $1 million project I turned down. Maybe it wouldn't change how he felt about me, but maybe it could show him that love doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it's invisible until someone points it out. And on his 30th birthday, I planned to point it out. After Claire's passing, I told myself I'd try harder. I thought with time, Daniel would understand that I had always cared, even if I didn't show it in the right ways. So I started reaching out, at first cautiously, then persistently. I sent letters on his birthdays, Christmas, and sometimes just because I had a memory I wanted to share. I'd write about the time we built that crooked birdhouse together, or how his first Little League trophy sat on our mantel for years. My handwriting wasn't perfect, but every letter carried the same hope. Maybe this time, he'll write back. I sent gifts too. Nothing extravagant, just thoughtful. A leather-bound journal when he graduated college. A watch when he got married. I never got a thank you card, but I told myself that didn't matter. I wasn't doing it for thanks. I was doing it to keep a fragile thread between us from breaking completely. Phone calls were harder. He almost never answered. Sometimes the call would go to voicemail before the first ring finished. I'd leave short messages, awkward in tone. Hey Daniel, it's Dad. Just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing okay. Most of the time, I didn't hear anything back. There was one message I remember leaving in the middle of the night. I'd had a dream about him, about when he was little, and we were at the park, him running ahead of me, laughing. I woke up feeling like I'd been given a second chance, even if only in a dream. So I called. My voice cracked as I spoke into the phone. I miss you, son. I miss you. That one went unanswered too. Then came twist 2. 5 years ago, I sent a letter that felt different from all the others. It wasn't just another, "How are you?" or "Happy birthday" card. This one was raw, stripped of every excuse I'd leaned on before. I told him about the project I'd turned down, the millions I'd walked away from just to stay near him. I admitted my fears, that I didn't know how to be a father after so many mistakes, that I was terrified he would never forgive me. I sent it certified mail, hoping the formality might make it harder to ignore. A week later, I opened my mailbox and saw my own handwriting staring back at me. The envelope was still sealed, a red stamp across the front. Return to sender. Addressee refused. I remember just standing there, the cold wind hitting my face, trying to process what I was seeing. Did Daniel really reject it? Or had someone else turned it away? I couldn't know. I kept that envelope. I never opened it, afraid that doing so would cheapen its intent. It sits in my desk drawer, pristine, as if waiting for the right moment to be delivered. That was the day I stopped writing as often. My calls became fewer, spaced months apart. It wasn't because I stopped caring. It was because I started to wonder if every effort I made was just another intrusion. Still, I couldn't stop entirely. Every so often, I'd try again. One Christmas, I sent him a framed photograph of his mother holding him as a baby. I didn't hear back. On his 28th birthday, I called and left a message. This time, the mailbox was full. The silence was heavy, but I learned to live with it. Or at least I pretended to. Yet a question began to gnaw at me. Had Daniel ever read any of my letters? That returned envelope planted a seed of doubt. I began to imagine different scenarios. Maybe he never saw them. Maybe someone intercepted them. Or maybe he read every word and chose silence anyway. Either way, the outcome was the same. A wall I couldn't climb. When friends asked about him, I'd smile politely and say, "Oh, he's busy with work. We don't talk much, but he's doing well." It was easier than explaining the truth, that my son and I were strangers who shared a last name. Despite the rejections, despite the silence, I never fully gave up. I couldn't. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I believed there would be a moment, one moment, when he'd want to hear me out. As his 30th birthday approached, that hope began to stir again. It had been years since the returned letter, years since I'd tried anything beyond a simple holiday card. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this milestone was my last chance to reach him before the gap became permanent. And so I began preparing, not with another casual greeting, but with something more deliberate. I went back to the drawer where I kept all the unsent letters, including the one that had been returned. I reread each one, my hands trembling at times. The paper yellowed slightly with age. I thought of all the words he had never read, all the moments I had tried to preserve in ink. And I wondered, for the first time in a long time, if this wasn't just about whether he would read them. Maybe it was about whether I could stand to hear his answer. In the years after Claire passed, I began to wonder about all the silence. At first, I assumed Daniel was simply choosing not to answer me. But the more I thought about it, the more I remembered things Claire had done. Small, almost invisible actions that started to look different in hindsight. Claire was a kind woman, but she had a fierce instinct to protect Daniel. When we were married, she often acted as the filter between him and me. If I missed a school event, she'd soften the explanation. If I forgot to call during a business trip, she'd say I was working hard for the family. Her goal was never to lie. At least that's what I thought at the time. But now, years later, I began to realize how much she decided he should and shouldn't know. There was a moment I can't get out of my head. It was shortly after Daniel's 15th birthday. We had an argument about something. Money, I think. Claire was upset that I'd missed another school event. I told her I'd written Daniel a long letter explaining myself, even apologizing. A few weeks later, I asked Daniel if he'd read it. He looked at me blankly, like he had no idea what I was talking about. At the time, I thought maybe he'd just thrown it away. But now, I remember Claire's face that night. Calm, composed, too quick to change the subject. That wasn't the only time. I recall another incident, years later, when I mailed a package for Daniel's high school graduation. It was nothing extravagant, just a book of architecture I thought he'd enjoy, with a note inside congratulating him. Weeks passed with no word from him. When I mentioned it to Claire, she said, "Oh, he's busy, Rich. Don't take it personally." Her voice was soft, but her eyes avoided mine. I didn't think much of it then. But after she passed, while going through her belongings, I came across a small box in her closet. Inside were several envelopes, my handwriting, all addressed to Daniel. All unopened, twist 3. I remember sitting on the floor of our bedroom, holding that box like it was radioactive. There were birthday cards, holiday cards, even that letter I'd written before his 15th birthday, each one carefully stacked, tied with a ribbon. It was as if Claire had been keeping them as artifacts, preserving them, but never delivering them. Why? I sat there for hours, going through the letters one by one. My words looked strange to me after all these years. Earnest, flawed, sometimes desperate. I began to see a pattern. Many of them were written after moments of conflict, times when Claire had been especially protective of Daniel's feelings. It hit me then. Claire hadn't just been protecting him from my absences. She'd been protecting him from my attempts to explain them. In her mind, maybe the explanations would only hurt more, make him feel guilt or confusion. Maybe she thought keeping the letters from him was an act of love. I wanted to be angry at her, but I couldn't bring myself to hate her for it. I knew Claire's heart. She adored Daniel. She wanted him to grow up without bitterness, without feeling like he was in the middle of a tug-of-war. Still, the realization cut deep. All those years I thought my words had fallen on deaf ears. They'd never reached him at all. The wall between us wasn't just built from my mistakes. It had been reinforced by her silence. From an outside perspective, maybe she was wrong to keep them. Maybe she should have let Daniel see me trying, even if those attempts were flawed. But she made the choice she thought was right in the moment. What I didn't realize then was how that choice would echo years later. Finding that box didn't solve anything. I didn't rush to Daniel's door, waving the letters as proof that I'd been trying all along. I knew that wouldn't work. It would look like an excuse, a manipulation. And deep down, I wasn't ready to blame Claire in front of him. How do you tell your son that the mother he adored made choices that shaped his view of you? So I kept the box. It sits in my closet to this day, sealed, untouched. Sometimes I imagine handing it to Daniel someday, not as evidence, but as history. Proof of how complicated love and family can be. As his 30th birthday approached, I thought about that box constantly. It wasn't just the new letter I was holding in my hands. It was the weight of all the letters that never made it. All the words he had never read. Maybe, I thought, it was time for some of those words to finally reach him. I woke up early on the morning of Daniel's 30th birthday, but the truth is, I hadn't really slept. For weeks, I had been preparing for this day, not with balloons or a cake, but with words. Words I'd carried for years, words that had lived in drawers and boxes in my own chest, waiting for the right moment to be spoken. The letter I was bringing today wasn't just another card. It was the culmination of decades of silence, regret, and choices he never knew I'd made. I'd rewritten it half a dozen times over the past month, each draft softer, sharper, then softer again. This time, there would be no justifications, no self-defense, just the truth, bare and unpolished. I began the letter by admitting my failures, every missed birthday, every empty seat where I should have been. I told him about the nights I stayed late at work, thinking I was building security for him, not realizing I was dismantling something far more fragile. I confessed the mistakes I'd been too proud to admit when I was younger. Then I shifted to the things he didn't know. The sacrifices I'd never mentioned, because I didn't want him to think I was bargaining for his forgiveness. The projects I turned down, the promotions I refused, all because I wanted to be close to home. I didn't tell him this for gratitude. I told him because I realized he'd built his idea of me on only half the story. And then came twist 4. I slid a small photograph into the envelope with the letter. It was worn at the edges, the colors slightly faded. In it, a teenage Daniel was standing in the outfield, glove on his hand, looking toward the stands. The photo had been taken from a distance, and I doubted he even knew it existed. That was the only baseball game of his I ever attended in person. I'd shown up late, not sure if I'd be welcome. I stood in the far corner of the bleachers, away from the parents and the cheers. I didn't cheer. I didn't wave. I just watched. I stayed until the end, then slipped out quietly before anyone noticed. I'd kept that photo all these years as proof, not to him, but to myself, that I'd been there, that I had cared, even if I hadn't shown it the way I should have. Including it in the letter wasn't an easy choice. I worried it would look like I was trying to manipulate him, to guilt him into softening. But I also knew that if I didn't give him something tangible, the truth might feel too abstract. A photograph was undeniable. I tucked the letter and the photo into a simple envelope. No fancy stationery, no return address label. Just his name in my handwriting. The rest of the morning, I moved like a man walking through wet cement. Every action felt deliberate and heavy. I shaved, put on a clean shirt. Blue, the one Claire once told me made me look less tired. I even polished my shoes, though I doubted he'd notice. I rehearsed what I might say when he opened the door. "Happy birthday, son." Too casual. "I have something for you." Too formal. In the end, I realized there was no perfect line. All I could do was show up. As I prepared to leave, I passed by the closet where Claire's box of letters still sat. For a moment, I considered taking them with me, but I decided against it. This visit wasn't about dumping years of hidden history on him. It was about one moment, one letter, one chance. I slipped the envelope into the inside pocket of my coat. It felt heavier than it should have, as if every ounce of regret I'd carried was folded inside. The drive to his house was quiet. I kept the radio off, listening instead to the sound of my own heartbeat, steady but strong. The streets were wet from last night's rain, the air crisp in a way that reminded me of the autumn mornings when I used to drop him off at school. I thought about turning back more than once. Each red light felt like a chance to reconsider, but then I'd picture his face, older now, more serious, and I'd press on. When I finally pulled up to his house, I sat in the car for a moment, watching the front door. I imagined him inside, maybe with friends, maybe with his wife. I wondered if he'd even want to see me. But this time wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what I needed to do, no matter the outcome. I stepped out of the car, feeling the envelope press against my chest. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't. Today, I wasn't here to demand forgiveness. I wasn't even here to ask for it. I was here to tell the truth, whether he opened the door or not. I stood at the bottom of the steps for a long moment, looking up at the front door. My shoes felt heavier with each step. The small envelope in my coat pocket seemed to press against my chest, like a weight I could no longer ignore. The house was simple, but well kept. Fresh paint on the shutters, a small wreath on the door. I remembered when Daniel used to draw pictures of houses as a kid, his crayons never quite staying inside the lines. Now, he lived in a real one, built from a life that had nothing to do with me. I climbed the steps, pausing to take a breath. My hand hovered over the doorbell for longer than I care to admit. Then I pressed it. The chime rang inside, muffled but distinct. I heard footsteps. My heart thudded once, hard. The door opened. Daniel stood there. He looked older than I remembered, stronger in the jaw, lines faint at the corners of his eyes. His hair was shorter, neatly combed. For a split second, I saw a boy who once waited by the window for me to come home. Then the image was gone, replaced by the man standing in front of me now. His eyes didn't widen. His mouth didn't move into a smile. He didn't even look surprised. It was as if he had been expecting me and had already decided how this encounter would go. "Daniel," I said, my voice careful, almost tentative. "Happy birthday." He didn't answer. His gaze dropped briefly to the small envelope in my hand, then back to my face. I have something for you." I extended the envelope slightly, not pushing it into his hand, just offering it. "It's not—" I stopped myself before I could ruin it with too many words. "It's for you to read, if you want." For a moment, he didn't move. The silence between us was thick, almost physical. The air felt colder somehow, though the sun was still shining. Then slowly, Daniel reached out. His fingers brushed the envelope, taking it without looking down. I felt a tiny spark of hope. Just touching the letter felt like progress. He looked at it for less than a second. Then he raised his eyes to mine again. And without a single word, he stepped back, pushed the door halfway closed, and said nothing. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed louder than I expected. I stood there, my hands still suspended in the air as if I could hold the moment in place. The wood and glass between us felt thicker than concrete. For a second, I thought he might open it again, but the lock turned. That was it. I didn't knock again. I didn't call out. I just stood on the porch, the weight of years pressing down on me. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere down the street, someone was mowing their lawn. Life was going on as if nothing had happened, as if the door closing in my face was just another moment in an ordinary day. But it wasn't ordinary to me. It was the moment I had feared for years. The moment my last attempt to bridge the gap might have ended before it began. I stepped back slowly, my eyes still on the door. I thought about all the birthdays I'd missed, all the doors I hadn't knocked on. Now, after 30 years, I was the one being left on the outside. I walked back to my car, each step feeling heavier than the last. The letter was in his hands now, but that didn't mean he would read it. It could end up in a drawer, or the trash, or anywhere but his heart. I sat behind the wheel, but I didn't start the engine right away. I looked at the house one last time, half expecting the door to open for him to call me back. It stayed closed. I thought of the photograph inside the envelope, the one from his baseball game. I imagined him pulling it out, recognizing the moment, realizing I had been there even if he hadn't seen me. Or maybe he wouldn't recognize it at all. Maybe he'd wonder why I bothered to include it. Either way, the choice was his now. I started the engine, the sound breaking the silence around me. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rear-view mirror. The house grew smaller with each turn of the wheel, but the closed door stayed with me. Driving home, I couldn't help but think that I just lived through one of the shortest and most painful conversations of my life, and it hadn't even involved words. Still, I reminded myself, I had done what I came to do. I had shown up. That had to count for something. Even if the door stayed closed, I didn't leave right away. After the door closed, I stayed on the porch, my hand still hovering in the air as if Daniel might open it again. My body felt rooted in place, unable to take the steps back to my car. The sound of that lock turning replayed in my head, louder then the hum of traffic down the street. The air was damp, heavy. It hadn't started raining yet, but the clouds above were swollen, ready to break. I sat down on the porch steps, resting my elbows on my knees. Birthdays. The word itself triggered a cascade of memories, each one a sharp reminder of what I had missed. His 5th birthday. Claire had planned a party with balloons in the backyard. I'd been on a site inspection in Denver. I called just as they were cutting the cake, my voice awkward over the phone speaker. "Save me a slice," I had joked. I never got one. His 10th birthday, Daniel had wanted to go to the amusement park. I had promised to take the day off. That morning, my phone rang. The foundation pour for a major downtown project had gone wrong. I told myself it was just this one time, just one birthday. I spent that night alone in a trailer, watching concrete harden under floodlights. His 15th birthday. By then, he'd stopped expecting me. Claire didn't even plan a big celebration. I sent a gift through the mail, a leather baseball glove. I imagined him opening it, maybe trying it on. I never saw him wear it. Year after year, each missed milestone stacked on the last, until they formed a wall I didn't know how to break through. I leaned forward, my hands clasped, staring at the welcome mat. It struck me how many of those birthdays I had been physically able to attend, but chose work instead. At the time, it felt necessary. Bills needed paying. The future needed building. But now, sitting outside his house on his 30th birthday, I wondered if all I had built was distance. And yet, I also knew something Daniel didn't. For every birthday I missed, there were moments he never saw. Moments I had been there, unseen. Like the time I drove 3 hours to watch him pitch in a high school baseball game, standing at the far end of the bleachers so he wouldn't feel awkward. Or the time I sat in the back of his college graduation ceremony, too ashamed to approach him afterward, but unwilling to let the day pass without witnessing it. He didn't know I was there. Claire didn't tell him. That was the injustice that weighed heavy now. Not in a way that made me angry at him, but in a way that made my regret sharper. He had lived his life believing I hadn't cared. In reality, I'd cared so much it terrified me. But I'd hidden it behind silence, behind distance. I thought about the box of letters Claire had kept from him. I thought about the photograph inside the envelope I'd just handed over. Would he see it as proof of love, or just another reminder of absence? A drop of rain landed on my hand. Then another. The sky finally broke. Rain began to fall steadily, soaking through my coat as I sat there. I didn't move. It felt almost fitting that I should be sitting in the rain on this day, thinking about all the storms I'd failed to shield him from. I remembered the birthdays where he'd waited for me. Claire once told me how, on his 7th birthday, he'd kept glancing at the driveway, expecting my car to pull in. She hadn't told me at the time, only years later, after he'd stopped waiting. The thought tightened my chest. It wasn't just the events I'd missed, it was the hope I'd let him waste on me. That was what I couldn't undo. The rain picked up, drops drumming against the porch roof. I imagined Daniel inside, maybe standing just beyond the door, holding the envelope. Maybe he'd tossed it on a table. Maybe he hadn't even looked at it. I wanted to believe he'd at least see the photograph. I wanted him to understand that love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back row, waiting for a moment that never comes. I stood finally, my knees stiff, my coat heavy with water. I looked at the door one last time. I had come here to give him the truth. But truth is only as powerful as someone's willingness to hear it. As I walked back to my car, the rain blurred the edges of the street, the houses, the world around me. It struck me then that this might be the closest I'd come to him in years, and it still felt like miles. I slid into the driver's seat, the smell of rain and wet fabric filling the car. I started the engine, but didn't drive away immediately. I sat there, staring at the windshield wipers, thinking about every year, every birthday, every moment he'd felt alone. And I realized, maybe today wasn't about changing the past. Maybe it was just about showing him that I was still here, even if he chose to keep the door closed. I drove away from Daniel's house slowly, the rain streaking down my windshield, blurring the edges of the world. But my mind wasn't on the road. It was still on the envelope sitting somewhere inside his house. I didn't know if he'd opened it. I didn't know if he'd even kept it. Maybe it was still lying on the entryway table, unopened, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. What I couldn't see, what I could only imagine, was the moment he finally sat down and slid a finger under the flap. Inside the house, Daniel stood at the kitchen counter, the envelope in his hand. His thumb ran over the worn paper, the weight of it heavier than he expected. He didn't want to open it. He didn't want to give me that much space in his life. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe habit, made him tear it open anyway. The letter began simply, "Daniel, I know this may not change anything. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to have the truth." His eyes skimmed the first lines, expecting the usual apologies. He'd heard them before, at least in pieces. But then the words shifted. I had written about the contract. 15 years ago, I was offered a project in Dubai, 3 years abroad, a salary that could have set me up for life. I turned it down because you were here. I knew we were already distant, and I couldn't stand the thought of adding another ocean between us. Daniel stopped reading for a moment, his brows furrowing. He'd always assumed I took every project, every job that pulled me away from home. The idea that I'd turned one down, especially one that significant, didn't fit the story he'd been telling himself for years. He kept reading. Turning it down cost me more than money. The firm cut my hours on other projects. Eventually, I lost my position. I never told you. I didn't want you to think you were the reason. But the truth is, you were. And I don't regret it. He sat back in his chair, the letter resting in his lap. This was new. This was not the father he'd built in his mind. The cold, career-obsessed man who had chosen work over family every time. His mind flashed to memories of those years. He remembered the tension in the house, the long stretches when I was home but quieter, more withdrawn. He'd assumed I was angry, disappointed. Now he realized it might have been something else entirely, embarrassment, maybe even shame. Daniel turned back to the letter. I don't tell you this to earn credit or forgiveness. I tell you because I know you've been carrying a version of me in your head for years, and it isn't the full story. You deserve to know all of it, even the parts that make me look weak. He exhaled slowly, setting the letter on the table. His gaze drifted to the photograph tucked inside, the picture from his baseball game. He stared at it for a long time, scanning the background as if expecting to see me standing there. Of course, I wasn't in the frame. I'd made sure of that. He flipped the photo over. On the back, in my handwriting, it said simply, I was there. I always wanted to be there. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, leaning back in his chair. The rain outside tapped against the windows in a steady rhythm. He didn't pick up the phone. He didn't text me. But for the first time in years, the certainty he'd held, that I had never really tried, had a crack in it. Somewhere miles away, I sat in my own living room, staring at my phone, willing it to ring. The silence stretched on. For the audience, it was the moment where change felt close, like a storm about to break. But storms don't always arrive on schedule. Sometimes the air just grows heavy, full of things unsaid. Daniel folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. He placed it in a drawer, not in the trash. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it wasn't rejection either. And that, for now, was enough to keep the story alive. A week passed after I left Daniel's house. Every day, I checked my phone more times than I wanted to admit. Each time it didn't ring, I told myself I wasn't surprised. But hope has a way of lingering, even when it doesn't make sense. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I saw an envelope in my mailbox. My heart caught for a moment when I saw Daniel's handwriting on the front. It wasn't thick like a card. It wasn't thin like a simple note. It was heavy, weighted. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen table, staring at it for what felt like a long time before I dared to open it. Inside was another envelope, larger. My own handwriting covered it, and then another, and another. I slid them out one by one, and my chest tightened. These were my letters. Letters I had written to Daniel over the years, all still sealed, all never opened. The graduation card, the Christmas card, the long letter I'd written after his 25th birthday. All of them, untouched. For a moment, the weight of it nearly buckled me. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the years staring back at me in stacks of sealed paper. But then I noticed something strange. One envelope wasn't mine. It was smaller, with Claire's handwriting on the front. Daniel's name was written there, in her familiar looping script. The ink was slightly faded, but the envelope itself was pristine, as if it had been kept safe all these years. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here to explain things myself. I've kept some of your father's letters from you. Not because I wanted to hurt him, and not because I wanted to hurt you, but because I didn't think you were ready. You were young, and he had already disappointed you more than once. I thought if you read his words, then they would feel hollow, another promise you couldn't trust. I thought I was protecting you. Maybe I was wrong. If you're reading this now, I hope you'll understand that your father's absence was never about not loving you. He was clumsy with love, not absent of it. And whether you forgive him or not, I hope you'll know he always wanted to be in your life. Love. Mom. I set the letter down, slowly, the words echoing in my mind. Claire had never told me she'd written this. She'd never admitted to keeping the letters. And now here it was, her own confession, in her own hand, delivered to Daniel by some path I could only guess at. And Daniel, he'd chosen to send it to me. Was it to let me know he finally knew the truth? Or was it a way of saying, I see what happened, but it doesn't change how I feel? Yet, I picked up the stack of unopened letters again, running my thumb over the edges. They weren't just reminders of my failures anymore. They were reminders of a complicated triangle. Me, Claire, and Daniel, all trying, all failing in different ways to protect one another. The fact that Daniel had sent them back at all told me something. He could have thrown them away. He could have ignored them entirely. Instead, he made sure I saw them again. I didn't know if that was anger, or an invitation, or both. The last thing I took from the envelope was a small post-it note stuck to the front of the stack. Daniel's handwriting was sharp, almost clipped. I thought you should have these back. D. No explanation, no opening, no closure. But something about it felt deliberate, like he was forcing me to confront all of it again, just as he had confronted it when he opened Claire's letter. I sat at the table for a long time, the rain tapping softly against the kitchen window. The pile of letters sitting in front of me like a timeline of mistakes I couldn't undo. Somewhere, in another house, Daniel was sitting with the same knowledge I had just gained. He knew his mother had kept things from him. He knew my absence hadn't been as simple as it seemed, and yet he hadn't called. The silence felt different this time. Not final, not closed. It felt paused. Maybe this was his way of saying he wasn't ready to talk. Or maybe it was his way of saying the conversation had finally begun, even if no words had been spoken yet. The evening after the envelope arrived, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter from Claire. Her handwriting lingered in my mind like the sound of her voice, soft but unyielding. I read it again and again, each time hearing her unspoken apology for a choice she thought was right. I imagined Daniel reading it for the first time. I pictured him, alone in his house, the envelope in his hands. Maybe he'd been expecting just another letter from me. Maybe another attempt to explain myself. Instead, he found his mother's voice, carefully preserved across years, telling him the truth he'd never known. And I imagined what that truth did to him. For years, Daniel's anger had a clear shape. In his mind, I had been the father who chose work over him, over and over again. It was simple, it was clean. And then, with a few sentences, Claire had complicated it. She'd shifted the ground beneath his certainty. That kind of revelation doesn't erase anger, it makes it heavier. Daniel might have been angry at me for my absence. Now he had to ask whether he should be angry at her for hiding my attempts to be present. And what do you do when the person who kept the truth from you is the same person you trusted most? I didn't need to be there to know what that felt like. I could feel the tension in him from miles away. For the audience, this was where the emotional tide began to turn. Not because Daniel forgave me, but because they could see the cracks in the wall he'd built. His certainty about who I was had been fractured. He wasn't ready to welcome me back, but he was no longer holding a single, simple version of the past. Claire's letter had done what all my years of apologies could not. It had made him question the story. Meanwhile, I sat in my own house with the stack of unopened letters in front of me. I could have called. I could have sent another message. I could have driven back to his door. For the first time in years, I did none of those things. Patience was never my strong suit. When I was younger, I believed in fixing problems by working harder, moving faster, pushing through obstacles. That approach had built bridges and stadiums, but it had broken more fragile things, like birthdays, trust, and relationships. This time, I understood something different. If Daniel needed to work through this, I couldn't rush him. So I waited. Days passed. I went about my routine, coffee in the morning, long walks in the park, reading in the evenings. But beneath it all, my thoughts never left that envelope he'd sent back, or the letter from Claire now sitting on my table. I imagined him picking it up again late at night, rereading her words, wondering what else she hadn't told him. I imagined him looking at my letters, still sealed, wondering whether to break one open. I also imagined him feeling betrayed by her in ways he hadn't felt before. That's what complicated love does. It makes you angry at the people you miss the most. And I knew better than to think he'd just redirect all of that toward me. Sometimes, when people discover a hidden truth, they don't rush to the person they misunderstood. They retreat, trying to rebuild the ground beneath them before they step forward. This wasn't a movie where one letter changed everything overnight. But it was movement. And movement, even slow, was more than I'd had for years. In Daniel's home, the turmoil was quieter, but no less intense. He'd read Claire's letter 3 times the night it arrived. The first time, it was disbelief. The second time, it was anger. At her, at me, at the years in between. The third time, it was exhaustion, as though the weight of all those years had finally settled on his shoulders. He walked into the living room and sat down, the stack of my unopened letters beside him. He picked one up, then set it back down. He didn't open it. Not yet. It wasn't that he didn't want to know what was inside. It was that he wasn't ready for the emotions that might come with it. He thought about calling me, but the thought felt raw, unfinished. What would he even say? "I know Mom kept your letters." That wasn't a conversation you have over the phone. So he stayed silent. But silence feels different when both people know the same truth. Back in my house, I tried to imagine what he might be feeling. Years ago, I would have assumed he was angry and left it at that. Now, I understood there could be more beneath it. Confusion, grief, maybe even guilt. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to break through that silence. I wasn't knocking on his door or flooding his voicemail. I was waiting because I knew this wasn't just about me proving myself. It was about him deciding what to do with this new version of the past. In a way, this was the closest I'd come to being the father he needed, not the one who pushed and insisted and tried to fix everything on my terms, but the one who could simply hold space for him, even if that space was measured in days of waiting. The audience, watching this, would feel the shift too. At the start of the story, they might have been angry with Daniel. Angry at the cold way he closed the door. Angry at the years of silence. Now, with Claire's letter in play, they saw the complexity. They could understand why he'd built those walls, why he'd been cautious. And now, they could see that he wasn't just refusing me out of anger. He was trying to navigate a world where his mother's love and her secrecy coexisted in ways that didn't make sense. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was no longer rejection without thought. It was something harder. A pause before a choice. That week, I kept the letters on my desk, unopened. Sometimes I'd run my fingers over them, wondering if they belonged to me at all anymore. They were written for him, in a different time, with a different heart. Now, they were back in my possession, like a reminder that the past is never really gone. It just comes back in different envelopes. And every night, when I went to bed, I thought about the possibility that he was doing the same thing, sitting with his mother's letter, letting it turn over in his mind until it stopped feeling like a shock and started feeling like something he could carry. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know if he'd ever call. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't moving toward him. I was waiting. Because maybe, just maybe, This time, he would be the one to move toward me. It had been a week since the envelope with my letters returned. A week since I'd read Claire's confession again and again. Her words feeling like both a balm and a weight. A week of silence from Daniel that felt heavier than most silences. Because this one wasn't made of anger. It was made of waiting. That night, I sat in my chair by the window, a book open on my lap that I hadn't turned a page of in half an hour. My phone sat face down on the armrest beside me. I told myself I wasn't checking it. I told myself I didn't care if another week went by without a sound, but my mind was too alert, my chest too tight for those lies to hold. Then the phone buzzed. Just once. The vibration was short, almost casual, but it cut through the stillness like thunder. I stared at it, not moving, as if the message might vanish if I reached for it too quickly. Finally, I turned it over. A single text from Daniel. If you're free, come to dinner tomorrow. 9 words. I read them 3 times before I let myself breathe. He hadn't called. He hadn't said my name. He hadn't even called me Dad in the message. But none of that mattered. It was an invitation. After 30 years of distance, and after weeks of silence since his mother's letter, those 9 words felt like the first sunlight breaking through after a storm. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't want to sound desperate. My fingers hovered over the screen before I finally typed back, I'm free. What time? The reply came a few minutes later, 6:00 p.m. No extra words. No smiley face. No, looking forward to it. And yet, it was enough. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I moved through my house like a man who didn't want to jinx a fragile miracle. I cleaned the kitchen, though I wasn't hosting. I shaved, though it was still a day away. I even pulled out the blue shirt again, hanging it neatly on the back of the door. I sat down at my desk later and looked at the stack of letters still there. For a moment, I considered bringing one to dinner, but I stopped myself. This wasn't about the past anymore. This was about showing up in the present. Dinner wasn't going to be a courtroom where I presented evidence. It wasn't going to be a negotiation. It was going to be a moment, and I couldn't risk crushing it under the weight of everything we hadn't said. The next morning, I woke early. My body felt restless, my thoughts scattered. I made coffee, took a walk, tried to keep my mind from racing ahead. Every time I thought about sitting across the table from him, I felt my pulse quicken. Part of me wondered what had changed. Was it Claire's letter? The photograph? The truth about the Dubai project? Or maybe it wasn't any one thing. Maybe it was just time. Whatever the reason, I knew this invitation was a door opening, and doors don't stay open forever. That afternoon, I ironed the shirt Claire had liked so much. I took my time, pressing each crease carefully. I looked in the mirror and almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked younger, but because I looked like a man who had hope again. I left the house early, not wanting to risk being late. As I drove, the familiar nervousness returned. Every red light felt longer, every turn sharper. But underneath the nerves was something else, a quiet sense of gratitude. Whatever happened at dinner, I had already been given more than I expected. The chance to sit across from my son again. Back in Daniel's house, he looked at the clock around the same time I was leaving mine. His phone sat on the counter beside him. He had typed and deleted another message 6 times. Something simple, like, "See you tonight." But each time, he erased it. He didn't know what he'd say at dinner. He didn't know if he'd ask about the letters, or about the photograph, or about the job I'd turned down. He just knew that after reading his mother's letter, something in him had shifted. He was no longer certain that keeping the door closed was the only way to protect himself. For the audience, this was the moment where the emotional arc crested. Not because reconciliation was guaranteed, but because hope had finally taken a tangible form. After years of silence, distance, and misunderstanding, father and son were going to sit at the same table. And sometimes, that's enough to make the heart race. The following evening, I arrived at Daniel's house 10 minutes early. I sat in my car at the curb, my hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the porch light flicker on as daylight faded. For years, I had imagined moments like this, walking up to his door, being welcomed in. But those imaginings always ended differently. This time, there was no big speech prepared, no emotional plea rehearsed in my head. I wasn't here to make him forgive me tonight. I was here because he had opened a door, and I wasn't about to let it close again. At exactly 6 p.m., I stepped out of the car and walked to the door. My hand hovered for just a second before I knocked. The door opened. Daniel stood there, casual in a gray shirt, his expression neutral. It wasn't cold the way it had been on his birthday. It wasn't warm either. It was open. And for now, that was enough. "Come in," he said simply. I stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic. The table was already set. 2 plates, 2 glasses of water, and a bottle of wine off to the side. He gestured to the table. "Dinner's almost ready." I nodded. "Smells good." There was no embrace, no handshake, just a quiet acknowledgement that we were sharing space for the first time in years. We sat down to eat. The food was simple: roast chicken, potatoes, and green beans. But the taste didn't matter. What mattered was the quiet rhythm of the meal, the passing of dishes, the clink of silverware, the occasional nod of acknowledgement. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was tentative, like we were both testing the ground before stepping too far onto it. I asked him about work. He answered briefly. He asked me about retirement. I kept my answers light. There was no deep dive into the past, no mention of the letters or the photograph or the envelope Claire had left. And maybe that was the right thing. Maybe tonight wasn't about digging up history. Maybe it was just about proving we could sit across from each other without anger filling the space between us. About halfway through the meal, my eyes drifted to the sideboard. There, resting near a stack of unopened mail, was an envelope I recognized instantly. My handwriting. It was the letter I had handed him on his birthday, still sealed. I forced my eyes back to my plate before he noticed where I'd been looking. The fact that it was there at all meant he hadn't thrown it away. He hadn't lost it. He'd kept it right there in plain sight. For the audience, that was twist 7. The letter, still unopened, wasn't a rejection. It was a waiting place, a sign that he hadn't closed the door completely, but also wasn't ready to walk all the way through. We finished dinner without ceremony. Daniel cleared the plates, and I offered to help, but he waved me off. When he returned to the table, he poured each of us a glass of wine. We sat again, this time without food between us. He looked at me for a long moment, his hands resting loosely on the stem of his glass. I thought he might say something about the letters, about Claire, about anything that had happened in the past few weeks. Instead, he said, "The chicken was good, right?" I smiled faintly. It was. You're a better cook than I am. He smirked slightly, the closest thing to a smile I'd seen in years. And just like that, I understood that tonight wasn't about answers. It wasn't about resolution. It was about proving we could share a meal without breaking apart. When it was time to leave, Daniel walked me to the door. There was no dramatic moment, no promise for the future. "Thanks for dinner," I said quietly. He nodded. "Drive safe." That was all. I stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against my face. As I walked back to my car, I glanced once more at the window. I couldn't see the table anymore, but I knew the letter was still there, sealed, waiting. It didn't matter that he hadn't opened it yet. The fact that it wasn't in the trash meant there was still a chance. The audience, watching, would feel that suspended moment. The story wasn't tied up neatly. The door wasn't fully open, but it wasn't shut either. It was a crack of light, just enough to keep hope alive. Driving home, I realized something important. For years, I'd measured progress in conversations, in explanations, in attempts to make him see my side. Tonight, I realized progress could also look like quiet. Sometimes presence is enough. Tonight, I had been present, and so had he. Back in his house, Daniel returned to the table. He picked up the letter, turning it over in his hands. His thumb traced my handwriting. Then he set it back down. Not tonight, but maybe soon. The story didn't end with a grand reconciliation or a dramatic embrace. It ended the way most real healing does, not with a bang, but with a quiet, steady moment of connection. And that, for now, was enough.